Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video on mixed media, particularly the types of media that I use and how I mix them. And this idea came about because it was something I had mentioned in a previous video, and a bunch of you guys left comments saying that you were interested in learning more about it and seeing a video about mixed media, so I decided to make it today. We're going to go over, as I said, the types of media that I use, so the different types of art supplies and things that I use, and how I combine them and why I combine them that way, and then just other things that I keep in mind kind of as a part of being a mixed media artist, and other things that I consider in addition to the media and their mixing. So we'll have those three things that we'll go over. And if that sounds interesting to you, then you should definitely keep watching. But really quick, before I go into the details, I do want to mention or clarify that this is going to be a video about the types of media that I use and my process, and it's not going to be a comprehensive sort of direction or how-to or overview of using mixed media. I don't know how that would even be possible to do, because there are hundreds of different types of art supplies and media out there, and probably thousands upon thousands of different ways that you could combine them. Pretty much, if you can think it, it could be possible. There aren't any like set rules about how to do that, so it's kind of a limitless subject. So I'm just going to be focusing on the types of materials that I'm using currently, and things that I use regularly. So if they're random things that you've seen me use a few times, like gold leaf or acrylic or whatever, then I probably won't be incorporating them into this video. So yeah, I just wanted to give a little heads up about that. But now that that is out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the first section, which is the media that I use. So we're first going to go over the supplies that I use regularly, and I'm just going to list them off and kind of talk a little bit about the characteristics of each one and why I would choose to use it. I'm going to go over them in a particular order. It's going to be first the water-based and alcohol-based media, and then wax-based media, and then acrylic-based media, which is also water-based, but it's different than watercolor in terms of its permanence and its kind of sturdiness. So yeah, first thing is, which you've probably seen me use lots of times if you've watched this channel or if you've been following me on Tumblr or Instagram, is watercolor pencil. And I have been using watercolor pencils for several years now, and I really like them because they're very quick and easy and portable. But I generally use them in combination with other media. So if I'm going to be using watercolor pencil, it's usually the first layer of a piece. And I typically will reach for watercolor pencil if the subject is something, I think I've talked about this on this channel before, or maybe I've written it in an ask on Tumblr, but anyway, if the subject is something that is highly textural or has a lot of inherent texture, so like an example would be some kinds of pastries or certain kinds of fruit, then I would tend to find myself reaching for watercolor pencils, because the way that I lay those down, as I've talked about, I have a very kind of textural hand, and I find that like if those are the first layer, then there's already kind of an interesting base of texture going on. And then the material is very similar, would just be regular watercolor. And again, if you have been watching this channel, you've seen that I use that quite a bit too. So typically I'll use either watercolor pencils or watercolor for the first layer. And if I opt for watercolor, that's something that I'll be using generally if the subject is smoother or doesn't have that texture, or if it has like a lot of really tiny little fine details that aren't great for getting into with watercolor pencils. So examples would be like a lot of botanicals, certain produce, definitely skin if I'm painting a person. And sometimes animals too, like in that hedgehog piece that I did a little while ago. I think I started off with watercolor on that piece just because doing all those little, even though the back was very textured, the thorny part of the hedgehog, it made a lot more sense to just kind of go through and do the brush strokes for the little spikes than it would for doing the watercolor pencil for each spike. So I just kind of evaluate what the subject is like, and then I pick whether I'm going to do watercolor pencils or watercolor. And the next thing I'll use kind of at this stage, at the earlier stage of a piece, is marker. And usually it's like a Copic marker or a Prismacolor marker. Sometimes I use the fine liners. But I don't do a ton of stuff with markers. Usually if I do reach for them, it's because I want to like quickly kind of block in a shadow, or if there's an area of color that I feel like didn't get quite deep enough with the watercolor, I'll sometimes go back over that with the marker. Yeah, very minimal, but I do find that they're a nice thing to have, and I do find myself reaching for them more and more just because it can save time and it's easy. And now moving on from the water and alcohol based, oh, and the markers were the alcohol based thing, by the way, I should have mentioned that. I'm going to transition to the wax based media, which is the first one. And again, this is like the thing I use all the time, is colored pencil. And different brands of colored pencils have different binders in them, but Prismacolors, the ones that I use, are wax based, or they have a wax binder. So I use colored pencils for like pretty much everything. Colored pencils are how I develop the more kind of nuances in the colors and the different values and the form of the subject. And if I'm going to be trying to add texture, I'll add texture with colored pencils. But if I want to be smoother, I can also blend it out with Gamsol in between the layers. So colored pencils are probably, I would say, like, I don't know, maybe like 70 to 80% of my process. So there's like the first 10%. Well, no, they're probably like 70%, because like maybe it's 15% in the beginning that's the sketch and getting ready and the initial layer, but then I spend a lot of time building things up and developing things with the colored pencils. And then the last bit, the last little 15%, I hope my math is adding up, that last little 15% will be with the usually more acrylic based media, which I will go over in a moment. But first, the last wax-based media that I use is the water-soluble wax pastels, and I use the Caran d'Ache, my wonderful French pronunciation there, Caran d'Ache Neo colors, and they're really great. These are actually water-soluble themselves, but I don't use them that way. I actually don't really like how they look when they're blended out with water. The way I've been using them the most frequently lately is like added in with colored pencil. Like if I'm gonna blend it with Gamsol, and the reason I would reach for the wax pastels in addition to the colored pencils is that they are extremely, the pigment is extremely dense, so I can get much more saturation, much more opacity really quickly. So I might like lay down an area of colored pencil and then go over some of the top of that with the Neo colors, and then blend the two of them with Gamsol. And because they're made to be blended with water, the effect you get blending them with Gamsol is kind of different. It doesn't blend as easily. It feels very similar to blending with the colored pencils, where you kind of have to like really mush it around to get that binder to dissolve. But the end result, I think, looks a lot smoother and doesn't have the chalkiness that it can get when it's blended with water. And then occasionally, I've done a few videos using this method on this channel, but occasionally I will also mix the wax pastels with soft pastel to just increasing the opacity. And the selection of wax pastels in terms of the colors available, it's fairly, I mean, there's a good amount, but it's fairly limited. So if I'm wanting to like kind of create some background texture, which is generally how I would use it if I was mixing them with the soft pastels, it's nice to be able to reach for the soft pastels because there are a lot of colors in those. So I'll just kind of lay down the wax pastel and then do some soft pastel on top of it, and then blend it with water. And that has a really interesting look. Usually I have to do a few layers of it, but I will also link to a couple of videos where I have used that technique. And next we're moving on to the acrylic-based media, and this would be like the last 15% of the piece. So usually it's like for finishing touches and occasionally for other things too, but usually it's a smaller aspect of a piece. So, and for that I would use gouache, and gouache is similar to, well, there's a few different kinds of gouache. There are gouaches that are acrylic based, which is the kind that I use, so it's an acrylic gouache. And what that means is that once it dries, it's dried. You can't reblend it. There are gouaches that behave more like watercolor, where you can kind of like keep re-wetting them and keep reworking them. But the acrylic kind is a little bit stickier. So if you're adding it on top of other stuff, which I pretty much always am, it's nice to have that acrylic binder in there because it can like really grab onto the other media and onto the paper, and it doesn't move. So generally I'll use gouache towards the end of a piece if I'm adding colored highlights, or if I want to add some areas of like flat, really dark shadow. Occasionally I will use it in a more prominent way in the beginning of a piece if I'm working on something that has a really smooth texture, or I've used it a lot for like different chocolate desserts. So like if it's the top of a chocolate tart or something, just to have that really kind of smooth, even look to it. Gouache is great for that. But yeah, usually it's more of the accents of creating like the highlights and the shadows. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about today are paint pens, which are also acrylic based. There are oil based ones as well that you can get, but I like to blend them with my fingers, and it's just a little bit less bad for you if you're blending with your fingers to be blending an acrylic base as opposed to an oil base. But the oil based ones exist, and they're great as well. They're actually probably a little bit more intense in terms of the pigment. And paint pens would be a very similar, the way I use them is very similar to the way that I would use gouache, which is just for kind of final highlights and final opaque highlights. So if I really want something to pop and read as white, then I will reach for the paint pen. And same with the black. If I just have a few little areas that I really want to push back and have a really dark shadow, then I'll reach for the paint pen. And so yeah, that's pretty much the things that I'm using regularly at the moment. So now I'm going to transition to talking about how I combine those things. And the first kind of good general rule to keep in mind is that you want to try to use kind of in the order that I mentioned them. So the things that are water soluble, or well, the water-based things and the alcohol-based things, you want to try to use those towards the beginning of your painting or your piece, whatever. And then the wax-based things, you like the colored pencils and the Caran d'Ache Neocolors, use those towards the middle of your painting. And then if you're going to be doing anything with acrylics, whether it's gouache or actually just even regular acrylics as well, then using those towards the end of the painting. If you're starting out, you want to think of like, well, what are the things that require a lot, that are really wet, that require a lot of absorbency. So like that would be the watercolor pencil. And so that's why I use those first, because then they're the first thing on the paper and they can soak right in. And while acrylic and gouache are also water-based, because of having the acrylic binders in there, it kind of seals off the paper. So if you put those down first, you can add colored pencil on top of them, but it's going to be much more difficult and you're not going to be able to get as many layers down. So you want to be thinking in terms of like, what are the things that need to really be able to soak into the paper, but that are going to let me build other stuff on top of them without kind of sealing off the paper. And I don't always follow that rule. So even though I do sort of generally go water, alcohol-based, wax-based, acrylic-based, or actually ignore the order of my hands, water, alcohol, wax-based, and then acrylic. that's usually how I do it. Sometimes there are certain circumstances where I'll hop out of that order. And one situation that I might do that in is like sometimes if I've made a mistake, or if there's something that I don't like, an area of a certain piece that I don't like how it's going, I will just add a kind of a thin layer of gouache over the top of it. And that will let me, it doesn't always work, and you have to be careful that, like, if you have tons of layers underneath, it won't work very well. But there are times when it can just be like a nice little fresh start in an area if you're not liking how that area is going. And in that case, I'll usually then add more colored pencil on top, because it would look really weird if like the whole thing was rendered colored pencil and then there's just one random area that's gouache. It would look like I tried to cover something up. And that can work, as I said, if there aren't too many layers underneath. But you have to be really careful, because the gouache sometimes will kind of, if there's a lot of layers, the gouache will flake off with the colored pencil. So I try not to do that. That's like a last resort, but it does happen sometimes. And then another thing that is kind of against my rules here that I will do on occasion is to use marker on top of colored pencils. And that's generally something I would do if I am feeling like there's too much paper peek through, particularly like in a mid-tone area. So I don't want to get really heavy with the colored pencil, because I want to keep the texture intact, like if I'm doing a pastry or something. But I do kind of want to darken the base. And in that case, I would add some marker over the top. Usually if it's like, only if it's a similar color. So like if it's a pastry, I'm kind of like working in those golds and yellows and browns, then I would choose a marker of the same color just to kind of deepen an area. And that's really not the nicest way to treat your markers. Some people have seen me do that in the video and have commented, and it's true that they can kind of like get some of the wax stuck in them, and it makes them not perform as well. But I find that if I don't do it very often, and if I kind of like really quickly run the marker over a clean piece of paper after I'm done, like before I put the cap back on, it's not so bad. And again, like that's usually a last resort, something I do to if I want to fix a mistake that I've made. And beyond that, I would say if you want to know whether a combination or order works, then just experiment. That's how I have figured this stuff out. And yeah, it can be risky sometimes, but also fun. So the last thing I want to mention before I wrap up is other considerations to keep in mind when working with mixed media. And for me, the sort of number one thing, and I've already touched on this a bit, but is the absorbency and toughness of your substrate. So like the video I did last week, again, that donut painting, that had a very tough substrate, which was the birch panel, but it wasn't very absorbent. So I ended up running into a lot of problems with wanting to put, I usually do lots of layers of colored pencil, and it really would only take like a couple of layers. So I ended up having to rework things and use some different combinations that I wasn't expecting to have to use. So generally, that's why I reach for paper, because if you get the right kind of paper, it can be very absorbent and very tough. So if I'm working on a subject that has a lot of texture, again, like I will typically reach for a cold pressed, a high quality cold pressed paper, and that's because the cold press is very textural and it has lots of little, we call them teeth. So the paper has like a toothiness to it. So if you imagine like this is the paper and you're running the pigment over the top of it, it gets down in these little crevices and the paper can hold on to it. So that makes it very absorbent, and it's good for like working with different kinds of media on that. And then if I want something to be smoother, then this is something I just started doing recently. If I want something to be smoother, I will use printmaking paper. And printmaking paper is very smooth, or it can be very smooth, but it's also really sturdy and really absorbent because it's made for like being beat up, essentially, like completely saturated in different chemicals and stamped with different plates and all of that. So so yeah, generally smoother applications, I'll go for the printmaking paper, and more textural applications, I'll go for the cold pressed. But they're both highly absorbent and they're both very sturdy. So I would not recommend trying to work in mixed media with a cheap paper or just like a printer paper, or even some nicer cardstocks, which are really fun for drawing on, like in pencil or kind of treated like a Bristol board. They're not going to be tough enough to take all the different abuse of the layers and layers of different media. I do occasionally use hot press paper, which can be very sturdy and absorbent as well, but in my experience it does not take as many layers as cold pressed or a printmaking paper. Yeah, I'll pretty much only go for that if I know that the thing I'm making is not going to have that many layers. Yeah, so I think that's about it for this video. I hope you guys liked it and got a little bit of a window into how I combine the media I use, and hopefully there was some stuff that you could take away for your own process as well. Yeah, so if you're wanting to experiment and try things, I would say again, just like go for it, try the different combinations. There's no way to know exactly how it's going to work until you try it. And if it's not working for you, try it on a different kind of paper or a different substrate. Yeah, so there really aren't any concrete rules with mixed media. So I would just encourage you, if you're wanting to try it, to just start experimenting. Yes, and if you did like this video, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. I post new videos every Friday. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!